Hi, Megan. This is Gary. Just trying to see how this is going to work because I'm really worried right now about technology. I just signed in to start a practice session. Can you see as a panelist that you can sign in to this practice session before I actually punch the button later on to start the webinar? Because I must admit, since I did the time change on this, because of a mistake I made earlier trying to allow for early start for us. I'm really concerned about whether all these details are going to work out. I just noticed that I'm concerned, right? What can I say? I'm panicking right this second. Okay. If that doesn't work, then I've got to go back and sign in and start over. Right now it says that I'm in a practice session. I want to keep you on the phone till we make sure we can get this thing working. Tell you. Sometimes they just have too many buttons. Okay, thank you. Fantastic. You are a wonderful person. Did I ever tell you that? That I'll let me tell you, the fact that I can see you right now just does my heart a lot of good. Oh, all right. So we start the webinar at exactly 1. That means the panelists can sign in early as a part of this practice session. All right. So I'm just going to leave this open because if you don't mind, and let them join anytime they come. So you can come back if you want in a few minutes, because right now I have it's about 15, 16 minutes before it begins. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to turn off the phone. So one last question, and that is, do you have any idea how many people have signed up? Because I haven't seen any of that data. You're my 5th meeting this morning, and I have 2 more later. It's just been one dang thing. Okay, then I'll check it out afterwards. By the way, the last time we had 83 signed up. Okay, so I was very pleased with that. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. She is. Megan, did you receive any response from the panelists to your email of a day or so ago?
I got a thank you from Dexter, but I didn't hear anything from Dr. Wilson or his assistant. But I did make sure to CC his assistant just in case.
Well, that's good. I appreciate you doing that. I'm really worried about it because I've only had 2 communications from them in the entire process, and I'm really hopeful that nothing falls through the cracks on this one again.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess worst case scenario, if there, since Dexter's going first, if Dr. Wilson's not signed on by the time Dexter has started, when Dexter is presenting, I should be able to call Dr. Wilson's assistant. But
Okay.
yeah,
that's the
hopefully we're
best we
just
can
on their
do.
calendar and yeah, see how it
Best we
goes.
can do.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I'm going to give a similar introduction for about 90 seconds or so that I've done in the past. If you want to add to it, it's feel free. Okay.
Yeah, I have just a quick, I'm working on my notes app, so it's just kind of off in the corner right now, but I have a brief topic, like, introductory topic statement, reminders to keep an eye out for next events. So for next month, I've started making some contacts as far as panelists for invasive species policy.
Yeah, I want to call it the war on invasives, and I want to talk to you about that further because DNR and a couple of the other potential sponsors want to know what lies ahead. And I'm willing to give them up to a quarter. You saw a summary of that in an earlier email I shared with you. And I'll go back and repeat that, but I would like to have another conversation with you within the next week about looking ahead, okay?
Sure, yeah, let's we can set that up. Yeah, because there are, we had a Maryland Invasive Species Council meeting this morning where
Good.
a couple of issues with the some of the upcoming bills were raised. So I guess that's HB 15.
Yeah, that's the main one.
Yeah. So there's a couple people from that that council that would be really promising. I know they'll have to navigate, like Kim Rice, I think would be a really excellent person to have. I know she always has to navigate what their, external communications policy is. So I'll reach out to her again, but I mentioned it during the meeting that we would be having this event. So the seed has been planted.
Okay, well, the concept of discouraging, and I could use a stronger word, I suppose, invasive, is also written into House Bill 991 on the 5 million trees that we passed last year, because I wrote it into that. Actually, I tried to broaden it, but the stakeholders just didn't buy it. So it focuses a lot simply on vines. I wanted to be more broad than that, but we had a couple strong advocates who were concerned about that language. So
yeah, let's definitely talk about that. And I know, so within, now is that separate from or in addition to the funding that was put in place as part of the 5 million trees to support, invasive plant removal, or was that a bill that was folded in with the Tree Solutions Now Act?
it's folded in. There isn't a lot of money just directed toward that end. As a matter of fact, it's kind of incidental to the planting of trees which is the larger purpose, and that has 15 million behind it. But the truth is, we can put some more money in another bill to do some other things. And frankly, I need your help in thinking about that, because right now there's more than $200 million worth of environmental legislation out there. And I'm working on 15 different bills. And so putting that kind of language in the bills is not difficult at this point, because they're still in drafting or in final approval. And that's the easiest point in the process, to add a phrase or line or concept to it that doesn't divert great attention, but concentrates a focus on it.
Yeah, I would definitely be interested to chat more about that, because for a lot of potential planting areas in the city, what we really need is to be able to clear up some of those vines and other vegetation from edges, and that can actually make afforestation projects more successful, because once we get the trees established, if we have a couple of years of integrated vegetation management in advance, then the survival of those plantings is just much easier to accomplish, because vine incursion,
We
smothering.
definitely need to talk.
Yeah.
There's a conversation about the 3030 bill, which I'm not going to go into detail right now, except to say that I could add a line in that one because it's going to look to the preservation of urban spaces for future small forests and green infrastructure in our urban areas. And vegetative management is a concept that I could easily add to it at this point.
Great.
Okay. So I have about 6 minutes to begin, and I'm just going by the computer clock on my screen. Let's be sure that you and I have a follow-up conversation by midweek next week, okay? I don't want to let it go past Wednesday if I can avoid it, okay? So look at your calendar and see what works for you. The 3030 conversation, frankly, is tomorrow with the two major sponsors and more than 20 other stakeholders. So I'll raise this vegetative management concept tomorrow in that conversation, because I've already written edits to the bill extensively about a week ago, but it's not out from the edit from the Legislative Reference Service that actually does the final drafting. I haven't seen the final bill. I only have a draft, and frankly, I'm not at liberty to share that widely, but in your case, because I consider you a staff person, even though you're not paid, I feel free to share it with you. So I'll send it to you, okay?
Great. Now, are you able to see from your view whether there are people like in a waiting room for the regular event?
No, I only see the practice session people. But when I start the webinar, they'll all show up.
Okay.
And I'm going to turn that on in about 2 minutes. I'll start it out at 8:58 and then call the meeting at about 1:01. Right now I have 12:56. So I'm going to push the button here in a couple minutes.
Sounds good.
All right. By the way, I'm very excited about the next quarter, which will focus on invasives. It'll be a look at the regional canopy goals for the Washington, D.C. area. It'll look at in the future changes in FCA, but the March one is going to be on the Hughes study. And I have the chairman of the Hughes study and the person who's actually doing the work who've agreed to be on the panel. So I have 2 of the possible 3 people already, okay? For
Great.
the March one. Okay, here we go.
Hey, Dexter.
Oh, pleased to see you, Dexter. I'm going to punch the button to begin to line folks up in about 1 minute. And we'll begin about a minute or so after 1 o'clock. So we'll have about a 2-minute preparation period, Dexter. Is there anything you need to talk with Megan about sharing, screen sharing or anything like that? And Megan, you have the capacity to do that without my intervening in any way, right?
Yep, should be all good.
Excellent, thank you.
Can I just confirm if I should go PowerPoint full screen and then share, or share and then go PowerPoint full screen? I'm not sure if that's gonna.
That's a good question. You might be able to do either. I guess if you can do like presenter view and then toggle back, to your Zoom window before hitting share, that should work. It just kind of depends.
Okay.
All right, friends.
Yeah, it
I'm
might be
gonna
an
punch the
operating
button
system
to
thing.
call it up now. It's 12:58.
Great. All right, I
People
see.
beginning to join now.
Yep, the numbers are rolling up. So welcome everyone. We'll be getting started here in just a moment.
We're about 2 minutes away, friends.
Any word from Sokobi?
Not yet. We got the confirmation that he would be joining us, which, very excited about. I think I tried to get him for the Urban Community Forest Summit a couple years ago, but he was already booked. So I'm really excited to get him this time. I wonder if he's just exceptionally punctual and will be joining at like 1 on the dot.
Well, I always worried about these things until the very end, to tell you the truth.
And I'm sure he's got a very full plate these days. So
We'll be starting in about 1 minute. Let's begin. Good afternoon, friends. Welcome all of you to our webinar, Framing the Future. My name is Gary Allen, and I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation, and we're very pleased to be the host for this event. I want to remind all of you that you are muted during this conversation, but we would be pleased if you would provide any questions you have in the appropriate box, chat box, so that we can respond to them in the latter part of the program. We're very pleased to present this series as a way of helping to frame the issues which will affect the forestry and the future of Maryland. We're interested in sharing broad ideas that have a policy impact on the planning for our future here in Maryland. We're pleased today to have a program moderated by Megan Carr, urban forester from the city of Baltimore. And I want to welcome all of you and remind you that the program will be recorded and provided on our website at a later date. Megan, please go ahead.
yeah, I'll just join Gary in thanking everyone for attending. So this is the January 2022 installment of the Framing the Future webinar series. So do keep an eye out in the future. So our next few months will be addressing invasive species policy, measuring forest canopy cover, and assessing canopy goals, and other aspects of forest policy in and around Maryland. So this month, our topic is policy past and present. So as we consider policy to guide statewide forestry and natural resources management, it's critical that we do so with an understanding of the current landscape and the policies that have both literally and figuratively shaped it. Often that includes unintended consequences of seemingly unrelated policies, as well as direct forest policy. So for one glaring example, the legacy of discriminatory mortgage lending practices and exclusionary housing covenants that led to inequities across communities today in terms of urban forest cover and exposure to health risks and environmental hazards. So we're very excited to be joined today by 2 experts who have done extensive research on these and other topics. So first up, we're joined by Dr. Dexter Locke. He's a research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service Northern Field Station. Before joining the Urban Forest, Environmental Quality and Human Health Research Unit as a research social scientist, Dexter was a postdoctoral fellow at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, or SESINC, which is part of the University of Maryland. He's an urban ecologist with degrees in geography, environmental science, and natural resources planning. Conducting applied research with urban natural resources managers is his passion. And when he's not doing urban ecology, he can usually be found rock climbing and hiking throughout the Mid-Atlantic region or listening to classic rock music. So welcome, Dexter.
Hello, welcome all. Thanks for joining. let me jump in. Can I have the share screen privileges, please? Thanks for that introduction, Megan, and lead in. I am going to start by talking about redlining. I don't have the screen share.
Gary, are you able to make that that change as host?
Megan, are you able to do the screen sharing? Because I'm not sure.
Since I'm a panelist, I'm not able to do that. There should be an option within your controls to enable participant screen sharing.
All right, let me see what all right, hold on a minute. Okay. See if that works, Dexter.
Success, I hope. Seeing presenter view or?
Yes, it's working. Thank you.
Looks good. Thanks for bearing with us.
Great. All right, so as mentioned, I'm Dexter Locke. I'm a research social scientist with the USDA Forest Service, Northern Research Station and the Baltimore Field Station, and I was tasked with discussing past, present, and future. So past, I'm really going to focus on redlining, and I love the way Megan set this up with policies that aren't necessarily forest policies that might have unintended consequences or be related to forestry today. So redlining mostly. And then I'm going to do an overview of some of the current research on the disparities of urban tree canopy cover and urban forestry. And I'm going to speculate into the future. So briefly, for those who are not familiar with redlining, as part of the New Deal, this was a policy designed to give home loans to Americans and protect against default. And so neighborhoods across the biggest metropolitan areas of the United States were broken up into 4 different types of neighborhoods. And the reason I'm focusing on redlining, even though there was a host of discriminatory lending practices and race-based policies before redlining, during redlining, and after redlining, it's consistent. It was race-based in part. It's spatial, so areas were quite literally drawn on maps. It was applied at the same time and it was widespread. And these 5 characteristics make it very convenient from a research perspective to apply. So here's an example of redlining. And so the intention was to provide areas in what was deemed best home loans, and then in lower graded areas, those were considered less secure investments. So the intention was perhaps good, but the criteria used to define best, still desirable, declining, and hazardous, to quote an example from here in Baltimore, description: an old residential section seriously threatened with Negro encroachments. A small section of Reisterstown Road consists of fairly modern 2-story brick rows, mixed, some Negroes. And so quoting from their description, their words, not mine, it goes on to describe the occupations of people that live there and the mix. So neighborhoods were classified based on who lived there, their occupations, the age and quality of building stock, et cetera. So you can see race is quite literally baked into this. And just some national overview. 2.75 million loans were given out under this policy. Less than 2% went to African Americans, about half of which were through a special military program. At the same time, in the United States, African Americans are about 10% of the population. So if you were African American, you had 1/5 the odds of receiving a loan in this way. So 1/5 the chances of home ownership backed by the federal government in this way, and to accumulate and transfer intergenerational wealth. And a lot of research has examined the impacts of redlining on things like education, poverty, unemployment. But as a geographer mostly interested in environmental things, particularly trees, we wanted to look at how redlining compared to tree canopy today. Back to Baltimore City, it's no surprise to many of you on this call that Baltimore has a lot of vacancy. It's a tough number to pin down, but some estimates say about 17,000 vacant homes and another 14,000 vacant lots. It's really difficult to get that number, whether it's those who are delinquent on taxes or from the post office, where is mail not being delivered. There's a variety of ways data sets to sort of triangulate that number, those numbers, and those are always moving. So we have a lot of vacancy in Baltimore, no surprise. And on the right, each of those black dots is a vacant lot or a vacant building. And you can see that overlaid on top of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, those that did the redlining on the right. And you don't need fancy spatial statistics to clearly see the overwhelming overlay of the vacancy on what was considered lowest grade, those red areas, which were predominantly communities of color. So what about environmental things? So in specific trees, we know trees reduce urban heat islands, which disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. So it's hotter where there's less tree canopy in low-income areas, and you may have less access to air conditioning, for example, among all the other environmental benefits that people on this call know about trees. So we wanted to know if homes, in A-graded neighborhoods were predominantly single-family detached homes, larger yards, and we would expect more tree canopy. And if there was a greater access to power in terms of getting investments in trees and in public parks, and successfully advocating for street trees, then we would expect greater tree canopy cover in A-graded neighborhoods than D-graded neighborhoods. So those are two plausible mechanisms, among others, that would explain this correlation. So briefly, we looked at 37 cities, almost 3,200 neighborhoods as HOLC defines it. And all the cities we could look at A to B to C in a pooled analysis. So that's everything. And to the left of that dotted line, the larger metro areas, we had enough data to look at within city variation. So we did an across city and a within city variation analysis. And so those are the cities and the distribution of neighborhoods as they were classified by HOLC. High resolution, by which I mean one meter or finer. High accuracy, by which I mean 95% or greater accuracy, is really now the industry standard for these urban tree canopy assessments, land cover mapping, which is now done across, these techniques were invented in Baltimore as part of the Baltimore ecosystem study with the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab. And now entire states are being done, regional assessments are being done. And now we're seeing tree canopy change studies that are being done, which is a lot more complicated than getting a tree canopy map, another tree canopy map, and subtracting them. Because there's a lot of statistical artifacts that can arrive, that can be induced from that approach. You really want to map change explicitly. But anyway, using high resolution land cover data. So you can see, actually this map is a 6-inch map. So every pixel is 6 square inches. Very detailed. And so here's the first finding. So I just want to direct your attention to model 1. We're asking the question, is there a variation across A to B to C to D? So on average, A-graded neighborhoods have about 41% tree canopy, and D had 20% less. But these cities are in different climatic zones, and so we need to adjust for the differences across city. We don't expect Miami and New York City and Seattle to have the same tree canopy cover by climate. So the second model says, is there variation across city? So on average, it's about 30% tree canopy cover, but this is saying about 23% of the variation is by metro area. And then the third model, we put them together, and that's really the model to pay attention to. And so what we're finding is on average, it's about 43% tree canopy today in neighborhoods that were graded A or best. These are predominantly single family homes, US born white families in the 30s, and 21% less in degraded neighborhoods. So imagine if it's a rainy day. Today it was raining earlier where I live, and imagine you had 43% of an umbrella. And then imagine that you had 23% of an umbrella. So 43 minus 21. It's a big difference. It's not only a statistically significant difference, it's a very meaningful difference. And I'll talk about more about that later if you'd like. So some of the within city analyses, we see the median estimate in LA is about 35%, and we see about half of that in D. And you can see that for every metro area, we found statistically significant higher tree canopy cover in A graded and then in D. A little bit of an exception in Seattle. These two neighborhoods are former industrial areas. They're now public parks. So these waterfront areas that used to be part of shipping areas are now well-used, well-loved public spaces. So that explains the high tree canopy in those areas. But the trend is the same. We sort of stress test our findings. We wanted to see, what if we exclude the largest metro areas? What if we consider all of the distinct municipalities in the greater Boston area as one, or as individual entities? Same with New York City. Do we call that New York City, or do we treat each of the 5 boroughs independently? And a couple of other tests about data source. And what we find is no matter how we include or exclude those various factors, the main findings hold, that previously A-graded neighborhoods have about twice as much tree canopy as their formerly degraded counterparts. It's a meaningful difference. It's a statistically significant difference. It's a very robust difference. No matter how we parse the data, we found that same finding. So normally redlining is an hour-long talk. I give onto itself. So just a brief summary. We know that trees provide benefits in cities. We know from historical archival research that redlining has been a factor in the location, allocation, the distribution of trees. And we know a variety of mechanisms for that. So we wanted to see if the patterns were the same in other cities. And overwhelmingly, yes, they were. So we suggested other process-based inquiry, historical account, look at other metro areas to see how that's unfolded. And all the input data and summarized data I've made freely available on the web. So that was one look at the past, right? Trees don't grow instantaneously. And so it stands to reason that policies affecting land use decisions in the past would affect what we see today. So what about today? Here's a paper called Trees Grow on Money. It's a cross-city analysis, and again, looking at multiple cities and multiple climatic zones: hot, dry, wet, cold. I wasn't part of this research, but I just love this paper for many reasons. So cities in a variety of climatic zones. And if you direct your attention to this red line here, we're looking at the correlation between income and tree canopy cover. And CBG is census block group, that's a census designation. And tract is an aggregation of block groups. So sort of a coarser aggregation and a finer aggregation. So at 2 scales, both block group and tract, in all of these cities, there's a statistically significant correlation between tree canopy and income. And we see similar associations, although it's not as consistent with race and tree canopy. So we tend to think more money, more trees, and these 2 meta-analyses, and meta-analyses are when researchers go and they look through all the different research on a particular topic, all the studies that fit particular inclusion criterion. So they had to look at in these analyses at tree canopy using remote sensing. So it captures all the tree canopy, not field-based random samples. And they looked at all the papers that looked at relationships between tree canopy and income, and all the ones that looked at tree canopy and race. And overwhelmingly what we find is higher income areas have greater tree canopy today, and communities of color have less tree canopy today. And there are some studies that don't exactly fit that, and that's mostly due to apples and oranges in their methodological approaches. There are some true differences that buck those trends, but by and large, I would say these are the two best studied relationships in urban and community forestry, the association between income and tree canopy, and race and tree canopy. And overwhelmingly, they find lower income communities, and communities of color have less. I just want to, so how did we get there? There's a paper I wrote several years ago, sorely in need of an update. These categories across the bottom are geodemographic market segments. This is what marketeers use to say, are we going to put a Starbucks here or a Dunkin' Donuts? Do these customers drive Volkswagens and Subarus or Mercedes-Benz and BMWs? They take a variety of purchasing behaviors and other data to create these different market segments. And I've arrayed them from lowest income on the left to highest income on the right. And the axis on the right corresponds to the amount of tree canopy cover. This is Washington, D.C. The green line is the amount of tree canopy. It's about 50% in high society. And the possible tree canopies. These are areas, grass, shrub, bare soil, impervious surfaces that could have trees. And on the left, this axis corresponds to the odds of participating in these different programs. So River Smart Homes, they will install free trees at your home. Tree rebates, this is the do-it-yourself. You plant a tree in your yard and you get some money back. And then we also looked at rain barrel programs. And so the way to read this, an odds of 1 is perfectly equitably distributed with respect to the population in that segment. So 1 says, let's say your segment, global roots, predominantly immigrant communities, if 10% of the population in that city is in global roots and 10% of the free trees in this program went to global roots, 10 over 10 is 1, you'd be on the 1 line. But what we find is in the highest income areas, we have odds around 4 to 5. So if you were 10% of the population in upscale avenues, you got 50% of the stuff, 5 times the odds of participation. And since we've done this research with Casey Trees and others in the district, they've modified their programs. I'd be really excited to look at an update of this, because in response to this research, they really have changed the way they work. And what we see in some of the lower income areas, you have an odds less than 1. So like 0.5 would be you're 10% of the population, you got 5% of this stuff. So corroborating that research I've done in New Haven, the #1 reason people requested a free street tree was to replace an existing one. That's the #1 reason to participate. So if we know that tree canopy is inequitably distributed based on redlining, based on current meta-analyses, based on current analyses, and we look at the participation in programs, and we see that it's mostly reaching high-income communities, and the #1 reason for replacing a tree, or for requesting a tree is replacement. Well, if you didn't have trees before, how are you going to replace it? So you can see a positive feedback loop being generated here, where areas with more trees will continue to have more trees. So what's in store for the future? Back to Baltimore, back to redlining. City of Baltimore now has a street tree inventory. It's a great resource on their website. You can zoom and pan around, look at the species and size. We overlaid that with our redlining map. We divided the city into these hexes to account for equal area. We wanted like units in terms of sampling area. This was a way to randomly do that. And so we looked at this is a species accumulation curve. The way you read this is you take the data, and as you go from the first couple of samples, how many species do we have? Okay, and then you go to the next, and we start, as we include more and more samples that we look at in the data sets, how many new species are we seeing? And then we parse that by the redlining categories. And there's a couple of ways to do species diversity indices. And we use 3 different ones that are debated among ecologists, but the point here is areas that were redlined not only have less tree canopy, as I've shown previously, they have less tree diversity in terms of street trees. And the city plants the street trees, so that is completely within the control of the jurisdiction. So what we're finding is more tree canopy, as I've showed you before, and then in this study, more different species of trees, providing offerings for different species of birds, more robustness against pests, and so forth. Apologize, this is busy. We parse the street trees by size. We call large trees greater than 20 inches diameter at standard height. We're calling small trees less than 5. I just want to draw your attention to Roman numeral 2, the big trees, and the small trees. And we're using size as a proxy for age, albeit imperfect, because street trees are a tough environment, right? They're almost like little bonsai trees, small tree pits, and they've got a tough life, right? So size isn't a perfect measure of age, but it's a decent proxy. So large trees would reflect the policies of the past. And lo and behold, we find larger trees in A-graded neighborhoods and smaller trees in D. But when you direct your attention to the right, we're finding statistically significantly more small trees, less than 5 inches, in formerly D-graded neighborhoods. We work very closely, the Forest Service with Tree Baltimore, Baltimore City Rec and Parks, Blue Water Baltimore, Baltimore Tree Trust, and so many other organizations. And they've been very responsive to our environmental justice research, tweaking programs and how can we adjust. And I believe this signal of lots and lots of small trees in formerly degraded neighborhoods is showing the effort to increase tree canopy and street tree equity in those low income areas. Many of those degraded neighborhoods are low income today as well. Tree canopy change. This is a little bit redundant now. This is a paper in coastal Los Angeles, just to sort of tie it together with the redlining, the tree canopy today, the participation in programs. Again, on the top, these are geodemographic market segments. The top, the higher income areas have more tree canopy. Looking at tree canopy change in B, the net change, they lost less. So they had more tree canopy persistence. I'm sorry, yeah, they had more tree canopy persistence. So what they had, they were able to retain. And then in the bottom, what they did lose was less. So higher income areas have more canopy. They're able to retain what they have and they lose less. And the reverse is also true with lower income areas having less tree canopy, less persistence and more loss. So in summary, I've tried to keep with the task that I was given, looking at the past, present, and future. I hope that by highlighting some of the research that I've been a part of and some other research I've witnessed in the literature, it's been informative for this group. I'm easy to get a hold of. I'm a very online science guy. I would love to continue this conversation both today and into the future. So please get in touch with me if you'd like. Thanks for letting me share.
Thanks so much for sharing, Dexter. Really appreciate it. I think we're going to do our Q&A all at the end. So if anyone has any additional burning questions for Dexter, or if any pop up as we go through Dr. Wilson's presentation, please feel free to add those in the Q&A. So next up, we're very happy to be joined by Dr. Scobie Wilson. He's an associate professor with the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health and the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the University of Maryland College Park School of Public Health, where he directs the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. Dr. Wilson has 15 years of experience as an environmental health scientist in the areas of exposure science, environmental justice, environmental health disparities, community engaged research, including crowd science and community-based participatory research, water quality analysis, air pollution studies, the built environment, industrial animal production, climate change, community resiliency, and sustainability. So very, very wide expertise. He works primarily in partnership with community-based organizations to study and address environmental justice and health issues and to translate research into action. So thank you, Dr. Wilson.
Well, thank you for having me today. Hopefully you can hear me all right. So yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about some of the background on EJ and some policy issues, and maybe trying to cover some of the things that Dexter covered, but I think it'll be a little bit of overlap, but then try to bring more of some of the public health elements to this discussion. So when we think about this conversation, and at least my work around environmental justice, we just celebrated Dr. King's the King holiday. And so one of the points I want to emphasize there, when we think about what policies, connect, how does environmental justice connect trees, I think you need to look back to in climate change and public health, look back to the work of Dr. King, we was assassinated, and his work with the Memphis sanitation worker strike. And I think right now in the country, you can look to so the erosion of democracy and sort of the attack on voting rights. Like, why would I bring it up in this discussion? If people's right to vote is really undermined, the ability to address local concerns is also undermined. So if you look in communities of color, there's always been this history, and you think about Dr. King and his work with the civil rights movement, it's about voting rights, right? And so we've had erosion of voting rights in this country since the passing of the Voting Rights Act. And so I think there are some deep connections between looking at issues of civil rights, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, in our conversation today, even when you look at the issues around climate change. For me, just real quickly, if you think about a lot of issues around climate change, many climate change issues are related to energy issues. And so if you think about issues of who's impacted differentially by climate change risks, you have to think about the whole energy life cycle. I'm gonna come back to that point in another slide. But if you know the history of the EJ movement, again, it's a movement that's really about people using civil rights approaches to, again, secure the voting rights, right? Secure better access to infrastructure, housing rights, et cetera. So I think Dexter may have already covered this in this early part of his presentation. But you think about the historical context, environmental justice. You look at Jim Crow policies. You look at issues of sprawl and development. You can look at FHA, and when it comes to housing, and as Dexter talked about redlining already, but the federal government played a major role in creating conditions of produce environmental justice. The federal government played a major role in creating conditions that lead to transportation inequity. The federal government played a major role in creating conditions that lead to housing inequity. So many of the reasons why we have inequities in planning, development, transportation, housing, you can look at the federal government's role. You can look also to the role of state and local governments. If you look at the book, Julie Z's book, Noxious New York, she talked about planning and zoning and how zoning was weaponized against folks of color. If you think about the city of Baltimore, Baltimore's the first city in the country that actually had racism-based zoning. It got thrown out by Supreme Court, but the remnants of it still are there today, right? So Baltimore is not the only major city in the country. You think about housing covenants, racial covenants, sundown communities, Levitt towns, all those things had basically sort of the embeddedness of race and racism, the embeddedness of otherizing communities, certain groups, right? And so redlining itself, if you look at the language used in redlining, it was basically otherizing other populations, other groups. So you really have to talk about that. So what's passed is prologue. So you cannot talk about environmental injustice without talking about the suburbanization movement. You cannot talk about environmental justice and its issues of climate change in urban areas without talking about white flight, the disinvestment, the divestment. You cannot talk about these issues without talking about policies around, highways. There was a recent discussion with Secretary Buttigieg around, someone said, why are he saying highways are racist? Well, look at our highway policy. The National Highway Defense Act, if you look at the language, that act was passed to build highways and byways on purpose through Black and brown communities to displace them, to push them out. So highway development has been used as a way to expulsive zoning plan development, so displaced populations. And so you can look at redlining and the history of segregation, both de facto and de jure segregation in this country. You can look at, planning, highway planning, and its role in basically destroying Black and brown communities. You think about the concrete and asphalt that was, that displaced not just the people, but the forest in these communities. And you look at Minnie Fullow's book, Root Shock. She talks about the fact when a neighborhood is destroyed, it suffers a root shock, a traumatic stress reaction, acute, but it's chronic. And this ripples across decades. So this highway building through Black and brown communities has rippled across decades. And so you think about how those ecosystems in those communities were destroyed. What you have today, what you see today is a result of those policies. And so when you think about all the concrete and asphalt, you think about the displacement of the populations, the loss of trees. It's basically, you think about the issue of climate change. I can basically say, duh, the urban heat island effect, et cetera. This is not by accident that we have folks who are dealing with differential climate conditions, differential issues when it comes to related to environmental justice. And so y'all know the definition. I'm not going to spend time on this, so I don't have a lot of time to do this presentation, but it's just wanted to highlight for you some definitions of environmental justice. This is the EPA's definition and a revised version by the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So you can see the slide. The next slide is more important to speak to my previous points about inequities in development. So this is a definition by Dr. Bunyan Bryant, and just for the framing for folks to think about communities as ecosystems. If you think about this definition and how people can realize the highest potential of what I explained in the isms, in this definition, it mentions jobs, recreation, schools, it mentions housing. So my point of this slide is, how do we move from unjust housing to just housing? How do you move from unjust transportation infrastructure to just transportation infrastructure? How do you move from just unjust recreational infrastructure to just? I think a justice frame is important when you're trying to address these issues. So in the problematizing and on the solution side, I think we need to focus on put justice forward, justice first, and also having a health frame is really, really important. So you see this definition from Dr. Bunyan Bryant, it talks about social terms of health, but it also talks about justice. So you need both. So any work that we're doing around climate change, any work that we're doing around making cities food cities or eco cities, or doing the food energy water nexus and bringing equity to that, we need to prioritize justice and we need to prioritize public health. Let's skip that slide. Skip the slide too. So when I think about these issues that we're talking about today in the context of, climate change, public health, urban environments, tree canopy, I think, the traditional frame of environmental justice, we talk about differential burden and of hazards. I made a point of going come back around to energy issues. If you think about issues of climate change in the context of this discussion and think about energy issues, you have to look at the life cycle assessment of energy. So not as important for this conversation is extraction, maybe transport of fossil fuels, but the combustion of fossil fuels in urban settings, I think is really important when you think about the issues of climate change and the impacts on public health. And so when it comes to those highways and byways I mentioned before, we are combusting fossil fuels, right? Gasoline and diesel that leads to combustion byproducts that impact air quality, increase greenhouse gas emissions, contribute to the urban heat island effect. And then the role of trees are really important, because if you don't have trees that act as a mitigating resource, so the lack of the ecological goods and services brought about trees in the context of climate change and environmental justice, you're missing the opportunities for air pollution mitigation, you're missing the opportunities for heat mitigation, you're missing the opportunities for noise pollution mitigation, you're missing the opportunities for stormwater management. So in the context of environmental justice and climate change, you need to have trees, because trees act as a resource on the climate change mitigation space. And so I think that's another frame to think about. If we're going to address equity and EJ issues, and how do forests contribute to that? I think those are things to think about. And another point I made earlier at the food, energy, water nexus, how do forests play a role in the food, energy, water nexus? And when we think about the environmental justice and climate change. So if we look at cities like Baltimore, cities like Detroit, cities like Oakland, other major cities like Philadelphia, we not only have an issue with concrete and asphalt, lack of trees for those mitigation benefits that I talked about before, those mitigation roles, but also in many cases, these same communities that are overburdened by the hazards to dealing with combustion byproducts also do not have access to food infrastructure. So there's an opportunity when you think about, and I'm not a forester, I don't work with the Forestry Service, so the trees that are indigenous that be more relevant to bring into these urban contexts, I cannot speak to that. But the opportunity for trees when it comes to food forest and urban agriculture, I think there's some benefits there when it comes to addressing issues of again, heat, addressing the issues around noise, but more importantly, because many urban communities, people have lack of access to high quality food infrastructure. That's another opportunity. So I just want to put that in for everybody's thinking. How do you bring in food cities? How do we create food cities? How do we address that issue too? So with environmental justice, you have to have think about the multi-pronged approach to an encompassing approach to addressing environmental justice. So how can forests have multiple benefits for communities that have EJ issues? So, and so when you think about some of these issues that I'm talking about, the overburden of hazards, combustion byproducts, that there's a continuum of disparities that people experience. So the burden issues, exposure issues, risk issues, and also health issues. And so you have the combustion byproducts that are important in the context of urban settings, like particulate matter, and then some of the health outcomes that people experience where they do not have in an urban environment, where they have a lot of access to tree canopy, or they may be overexposed, not a lot of access to green space. You may see issues around asthma, heart disease, stroke. There's a huge correlation between air pollution exposure and birth outcomes as well. So that may be part of the reason why being in urban environments when you have a lot of air quality issues and not having the ecological goods and services that you need from trees and other, biotic, sort of natural infrastructure could be a sort of a mediating factor when it comes to those birth outcomes. So climate change and EJ I've talked about a little bit already. I think back to the context of combustion byproducts, things that we need to be taking into account, not just particular matters I mentioned, but things like ground level ozone. I think, again, when you think about this conversation around public health, how do trees help provide public health benefits? So how would trees help with stormwater management? How would trees help reduce as part of heat mitigation and helping with reducing heat morbidity? And again, my point about trees and food access. We know about the impacts of climate change and food production. So I think this is a very relevant discussion, because in the urban ag context, how is that playing a role? How trees can play a role, again, as it relates to climate change? The consequences of climate change, we already know that due to race, class, and income, there's certain groups that are overburdened by hazards, but also there's differential climate risk across race, ethnicity, and also a class. And so poor people of color bear a disproportionate brunt of the co-pollutants from combustion of fossil fuels, but also a disproportionate burden of the greenhouse gas emissions as well. Okay, so I think we want to speak to that, that point. Housing, I talked about redline a little bit already. I think Dexter mentioned some of the studies, but there's been an emerging, growing body of work around redlining and urban heat issues. And so there's been studies done in Richmond, I think studies done by researchers at Portland State, and I'll talk about one of those studies real quickly. And if you think about urban heat islands, people of color, again, are more likely to live in an urban heat island. That can be, in my opinion, directly linked back to redlining, directly linked back to the National Highway Defense Act, directly linked back to those root shocks of urban renewal. You know, if you want to think about these issues around climate resiliency and equity, what are the roles of, you know, forestry, urban forests? What are the role of ecosystems and how equity and access, you know, equity and justice when it comes to ecosystems and environmental justice? We have to think about those questions. Let me skip this. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is as part of the current policies and future policies, we do have several executive orders that focus on climate change that I think will be of interest to this group and have implications as you know, as we move forward. So President Biden's Executive Order 14008, that's executive order that focuses on Justice 40 initiative. And you have you know, the administration's sort of re-entry into the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's some things that are happening at the federal level that hopefully will come down to the state levels and help us as relates to implementing policies to address environmental justice, climate change. In the state of Maryland, for example, there is legislation that Senator Penske is pushing to address climate change, which has, I think, some dollars in it to increase tree canopy in the state of Maryland. As I was talking about the Justice 40 initiative, that executive order, as we move away from dirty fossil fuels to a clean energy economy, 40% of those benefits should go to disadvantaged communities. There's a process right now of building the Justice 40 mapping tool. And those type of mapping tools could be beneficial in helping us to prioritize and identify communities that have EJ issues. And one of the indicators that could be included in figuring out where we need to invest resources could be a tree canopy, or it could be using satellite data, could be using land use, land cover data. There's a number of indicators, impervious surfaces. So you have areas that have 2 million impervious surfaces, and putting that into an index that could help inform where we need to plant more trees. So if I don't run out of time, if the moderator, if I didn't get to it, I can talk about it in the Q&A. But we do have 3 mapping tools that may be of interest to folks who are in the state of Maryland and folks around who are working from other parts of the country. In our state, we have built Maryland EJ Screen, which is an environmental screening tool, similar in some ways to US EPA EJ Screen, also CalEnviro Screen. We have built a updated Maryland DNR's Park Equity Mapping Tool. Now that tool is on parks. It's relevant to this conversation. It's not necessarily a tool that looks at tree canopy, but it gets at looking at equity and access to parks. And that's something that could be useful, again, as a decision support tool and where you want to plant more trees. And we also are building another tool, a climate equity and health mapping tool, to bring in looking at issues of climate change, equity, climate resilience, climate justice issues. So nationally, California has a mapping tool that could be of interest. Washington State has a tool, Michigan's building a tool, Minnesota has a tool, New Jersey has a tool, Massachusetts has a tool, North Carolina has a tool, New York has a tool. So for those of you who are interested in using GIS visualization tools to help you figure out where you need to put trees, the national tool that's being built, Justice 40 tool, EPA's current tool, which has been upgraded to include climate change indicators, and some of these state level tools could be, I would say these are really good tools that you can use in your work to understand what communities don't have access to good infrastructure. What communities are dealing that have more environmental justice issues. So that's what the state that before, because I probably run out of time. There's other legislation as it relates to this topic that's important. So there was a climate act signed in New York in 2019. Washington State has this climate commitment act that was signed in 2020. New Jersey has this cumulative impacts bill that was signed in 2020. California has this 100% Clean Energy Act of 2018. So there's a number of acts that are related to climate change that are relevant discussion that could help us really find ways to address climate change in a more equitable way. And again, tree canopy, natural infrastructure, green infrastructure is an important part of that work to make sure we have equity and justice as it relates to climate change mitigation. So I'm gonna skip some of these slides because I know I'm running out of time. I think Dexter talked about this a little bit, but just getting back to this issue of urban heat islands, redlining is an important driver, again, of creating conditions of environmental justice, and basically is a good indicator. If you have a redline community, you may see, as Dexter said, I believe, differences in temperature. Now, one of the newer kind of development processes or that we see is gentrification. So you think about suburbanization and redlining as drivers of environmental injustice. I think gentrification is another driver of environmental justice that can create conditions in urban settings that can lead to differential sort of impacts from hazards, but also differential access to infrastructure, whether it be built infrastructure or natural infrastructure, including tree canopy. So I just wanted to make that point. When you think about Baltimore's heat island, we see that big differences in temperature across East and West Baltimore. And again, why do you have a heat island? Concrete and asphalt, albedo effect, really recently heat, not enough tree canopy. And then what are some of the ramifications of that? A lot of places in Baltimore, older housing stock, people don't have air conditioning, have older citizens, then that means you're gonna have more heat-related morbidity and more heat-related mortality. So in the state of Maryland, the highest heat-related morbidity events, prevalence of heat-related morbidity and mortality is in the city of Baltimore over the last 5 or 10 years. So University of Maryland students, I know I'm low on time. I know we want to get to questions. University of Maryland students at the School of Journalism did a study called Baltimore Code Red, where they did some, not necessarily citizen science, but they put out temperature sensors to measure temperature in different parts of Baltimore. And, in other cities in the country, similar work has been done to look at, temperature and tree issues. Work has been done in Louisville, Kentucky. I think it's part of their Green Heart project. And as Dexter alluded to, wealthy areas of Louisville have up to twice as many trees as compared to poor areas. And again, my point of my participation in this panel was how trees are very beneficial when it comes to public health. How natural infrastructure, how green infrastructure is beneficial as it relates to public health. So there are some environmental aesthetic benefits, right? Ecosystem and conservation benefits. But again, putting health first, I think resonates more with many folks who live in EJ communities, and also putting health first can be a way to make sure that we are seeing changes in the natural environment, because people can actually see the benefits. We can see reductions in asthma. We can see improvements in other health outcomes. Just real quickly on this slide, this is a photo that shows those temperature sensors I mentioned before. So one of the previous slides, it showed that East and West Baltimore had 50-degree differences in temperature. But even on the same street, on the same block, based on the study that the students did, you can see in the surface temperature, you can see major differences in temperature. So with a house with one street tree compared to a house with 2 street trees, I'm not sure you can see it well on the photo, but there's a 20 to 30 degree difference between a home with no trees compared to a home with 2 street trees on the same block. So this just shows you the importance of again, having street trees, as Dexter talked about in his presentation. So we already know about the segregation issues. I want to belabor that point because Dexter hit on that. This is a surface, impervious surface temperature, surface map versus temperature. So again, when you see more impervious surfaces, you're going to see greater temperature. So in general, if we're going to address the issue of urban heat islands and also the EJ issues associated with heat differences, right? Heat is a physical stressor, in the context of each communities, they're already dealing with air quality issues, right? Different exposure to air quality, poor air quality, and then they're also dealing with different exposures to heat. So trees can have a huge role in addressing both of those. But to do that, we have to modify our built environment. We have to move away from, highways and byways and back to greenways, right, in these cities. You can look at some of the work that's been done by Pew, a charitable trust, in this funding of health impact assessments. I think the Atlanta Green Line, if I Beltline, I may misstating that, is an example of this. There's other parts of the country where folks are transitioning old bridges, old highways back into green space. And so those are types of best practices we need to see in like places like Baltimore, DC, other major cities across the country. Again, transforming that builtscape back into greenscape. Let me skip this. So I talked a little bit about health issues already. That was a heat wave in 2019, and here's some of the health implications. And so again, Baltimore is a great example to basically look at. When you see higher temperatures, you're going to see higher prevalences of disease outcomes, right? And so this is not just in Baltimore, but other parts of the country as well. You also see in Baltimore association between surface temperature, and Dexter talked about this a little bit too, and income levels. So in general, we do see, and this, let me just step back a little bit. So think about policies to address environmental injustice, policies to address climate change, policies to improve access to natural infrastructure, green infrastructure. One of those policies, we have to address the inequality gap in this country. We have to address the wealth gap in this country. We have to have investment policies, economic policies. I'm not a big fan to talk about the market. The market is driven by people. So we need to have an economy that's just as forward, just as focused, people-centered, right? And restorative. That's the economy that we need to have. And so the reason why we see these differences, it's an economic issue. We have an unjust economic system. So one at the core of what we need to be doing, and I know this may be beyond the purview of some of you who are in urban forestry and maybe some other spaces, but you have to be in that game. You have to be engaging with partners who are working on economic justice, who are working on addressing the wealth gap, who are just working on addressing the wage gap, who are working on addressing the fact that renters have been kicked out of their homes, who are working on addressing affordable housing. You have to be in that. You need to be connecting with those players. You have to be in that social movement. So I'm not sure if y'all want to chime in. How much more time y'all want me to go? I think we're gonna have 4 minutes to 2 o'clock. So I can take one more minute and then we can take questions. One of the things I want to highlight in the work that we're doing in these spaces where folks don't have access to a lot of tree infrastructure, they may have a lot of highways and byways. A lot of the core work that I do is building hyperlocal air quality monitoring networks. And so we have a network in Cheverly, Maryland. We're building it out across Prince George's County, Maryland. We're doing work in DC. We're doing work in Newark, New Jersey. We're doing work in Charleston, South Carolina. We're doing work in Savannah, Georgia. And the idea is to be able to capture air quality issues. So you know, looking at differences in inequities of air quality exposure and health outcomes, and then translating that data to action. One of the ways to reduce air pollution levels is by expanding the natural infrastructure in those communities, right? So just want to share that real quickly. And this is just a couple slides on that. And then my last slides, and I said this early in the presentation, I think it's really important to have mapping tools, screening tools that allow us to really understand the communities that have these issues and the communities that we really want to focus on. So where we can invest in those communities. So invest in housing, invest in food, invest in recreation, expanding the tree infrastructure. I talked about the Justice 40 initiative. Of course, the infrastructure bill that was passed. There's also resources available to help us in this area and making our urban environments more equitable, greener, more sustainable. And hopefully if Build Back Better gets passed in 2022, maybe there'll be more resources too. So I just want to, again, show you these tools that we built. There are other states that have their own tools. We have this park equity mapping tool that's very relevant to this discussion. There's a link to our climate equity health mapping tool, and I'll just stop sharing and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was really excellent and by necessity, very condensed view of a massive topic. We could easily cover this every month for the next year and still have questions and topics that we need to address. So Dexter was answering some of the questions in the Q&A chat already, so we might be able to wrap up pretty quick. There was one person who was hoping to find some links to the tools that you were just discussing. So if we have those available, if they're not immediately to hand, I could potentially send those out to our participants.
Yeah, I can put them in the chat. I'll give them to y'all. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're great. Yeah, that was actually the only lingering question we had. Does anyone? Let's see. So Sonia is looking for the Q&A chat. Depending on your operating system and your version, you should be able to see a Q&A bubble, along the bottom bar on your screen. And if you can't open that and would like, for me to send you anything directly, Sonia, I have your email and I could follow up with you.
Megan, this is Gary. I'd like to ask Dr. Wilson a question before we conclude the conversation. Dr. Wilson, I want to first thank you very much for joining us today. Your presentation was quite provocative and very useful, I think, for a lot of people. I really value presentations that stretch our mind, and you always do an excellent job of doing that. Let me ask you a question, because one of the critical variables that's consistently come up in the climate action planning processes that I've been involved in is how these EJ tools can help inform our future planning efforts, such as the work of Maryland National Capital Park and Planning. So I'd like to ask you, how do you see the relationship between these tools and the ongoing effort to actually plan parcel by parcel in a major metropolitan area like Washington, D.C. and Baltimore?
Great question. So going back to Dexter's point about the granularity issue, many of the tools you have indicators. There's like buckets of indicators. So I showed them real quickly. Socio-demographic indicators. You have environmental exposure indicators. We're actually in a revised version of our tool. We're going to take the climate change tool that you saw, the climate change indicators, and bring them into the EJ screening tool. But part of the problem is, to answer your question, Gary, the unit of analysis, as Dexter said, many of the tools is at the track level. So it's hard to get it down to the block level or the parcel level. The US EPA EJ screen is at the block group level. I think New Jersey's tool is at the block group level. Most of the state level tools are actually at the track level. So to really get that granularity, we're gonna have to get better data down to that level. But a lot of the heat data, the impervious surface data, you can use GIS to actually get that information down to the parcel level. But it's some data, like the health data, it's not available down. It's not available down below the block, actually below the track level. But one of the things that I'm trying to do, Gary, with my work with these mapping tools, we actually have developed an app called My Block Counts. And the idea is we have 10 to 12 categories that you can collect information on. Do you have sidewalks? Do you have crosswalks? Do you have flooding? Do you have access to a park? Do you have green space? Do you have a liquor store? Do you have a grocery store? Do you have a hazard? At the block level, the data is going to be geolocated. So that data allows you to get that level of granularity at more than neighborhood level. And Gary, that data, I think, is more appropriate to go into a climate action plan. We've actually been talking to Cliff Mitchell, who runs the Environmental Health Division for the Maryland Department of Health. We've been talking to, what's our colleague in Maryland Planning, the state planning agency. So we've talked about bringing this type of screening tool into the planning process. And so I think in general, if you look at Cal EnviroScreen in California, of course it's California, they've actually used Cal EnviroScreen for climate action planning. They've actually used Cal EnviroScreen for doling out dollars for climate mitigation. So there's already tools being used in the country for climate action planning, for climate mitigation. I was again, California is a better example, but when it comes to DC and Baltimore, we do have good tools, but getting that data at the ground level, we have to use apps like My Block Counts, just as an example of apps. There's other apps too, but more importantly, we have to bring in a citizen science, community science component to make sure we're getting quantitative, qualitative data from the local experts, and have that data be also integrated to the mapping tool to inform the planning process.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks for the question, Gary.
Megan, I think we need to draw it to a close. Unfortunately, it could go on. Obviously, I'd love for it to go on, but we have to keep our commitments to the schedule for those who have joined us.
Well, I just want to thank our speakers one more time. I, again, really enjoyed the discussion today, and thanks to everyone who joined to watch and learn.
And
Thanks for the opportunity.
please
Delighted to
provide
participate.
in links
I
for
learned
the
a lot. Thank
information
you.
that you shared. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks, everybody.